Alright, so this is going to be part 1 of a multiple part series on how to get better cinematics. In this video we're just going to be going over how to compose your shots, how to get better framing, and basically just work on the basics of composition. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to resize your frame to be, whatever aspect ratio you're rendering at. And the reason we do this is because when you render out a video, if you have it in, let's say you're playing in 16:9, you're playing in full screen, but then you're going to render as 4:3. So your normal comp when you're, deciding what you want to be in frame might look like this. But then when you go to render, it looks like this. And now, you have no lead room and your subjects aren't in the right spot and everything's messed up. So it's really important to make sure that your game is at exactly the same size, or at least the same aspect ratio approximately as whatever you're rendering at. So that's just the first thing. The second thing you're going to want to worry about is the rule of thirds. So basically what the rule of thirds is the fact that people like things aligned to the thirds of your frame. It's just visually pleasing, and it helps add a type of symmetry, and if you balance it out on both sides, usually it looks pretty good. So also really important to keep in mind is FOV. Now FOV is essentially the same thing as zoom. You can see if I have, if I'm far away and I want to zoom in on myself, I could just change the FOV. And I've essentially done the same thing as zooming in. Now zooming in is not the same as getting close to your subject. So if, say my subject is, I don't know, he's about maybe 1/4 of the frame right now in height. If I were to make my FOV small and keep that, the edges of our frame are, this and, I don't know, some pillars over here. But if I were to make my FOV really wide and get them to be about the same in the frame, the first thing you're going to notice is, the edges of our frame, or what were the edges of our frame, are now more towards the middle. We're going to get a lot more of the background in our shot. And the next thing that you might notice, it's a little slighter difference, is that there's going to be a lot more distortion. So as you can see, our player here, a lot of these angles are a lot more distorted than before, and especially towards the edge of our frame, they're going to be really distorted. So, they're not going to be as close to 90 degrees. Now, to use this effectively, you're just going to want to think about how much background you want in your shot and how much distortion you want. So let's say I wanted to get this shot, and I want, I only want this structure over here in the background. I can do that, but that's not really going to, there's still a bunch of extra space in our shot. So what would be more effective would be to back up and then just zoom in. And that's going to make it so that we can have, our subject is still going to be in frame at about the same size, but now we're going to have a background that's only, what we want it to be. Or conversely, we could say, I want our background to be most of the map. So if we do something like this, now we can see most of the map, and our subject is still framed, relatively, in the same relative size as before. So really, just by playing with FOV, you can use, I'm just using 30 and Quake Pro as examples because those are like the extremes, obviously, but you can really use anything in between for your Cines. It just depends, how you want your shot, but it's a really effective tool for framing because it allows you to choose, how much background you want in your shot, what you want in your background, and also, how much distortion you want in your shot. Another thing you're going to want to keep in mind is lead room, which essentially means that you're usually going to want to have your subjects walking into frame instead of out of frame. So if I did a shot like this, it might fit the rule of thirds, but if I wanted to do, a subject following lead room, or a cine following lead room, I might want to do something like this. The next thing you're going to want to keep in mind is headroom. And headroom is essentially the space above your character's head to the top of the cinematic. And normally you're going to want to not chop your, subject's head out of frame. If I were to record a cine, and let's say I recorded a cine like, I don't know, like this, it's going to look really weird because, the top of his head is just gone. And if, let's say my character jumps, I'm recording a cine like this while he's bridging, and he jumps, and his head is cut off, that's also not really good. So generally you're going to want to have space above the top of your head so that you can have the whole head in the cinematic. An exception to that would be if you're doing like a really close-up shot like this, where, the subject is like taking up most of the frame anyway, and it doesn't really matter if their head is chopped off, but for the most part you're going to want to keep their head in frame. The next thing we're going to be thinking about is leading lines. And what leading lines are essentially, lines that lead into, that kind of guide your eyes and show you where you're supposed to be looking. You kind of have to think abstractly about leading lines. generally you just want to have them pointing at your subject. So like if I were to do a shot like this, that would be pretty good. You know, maybe it's a little too far away. You could zoom in, and we have these leading lines going generally in the player's direction. And another thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that, you know, power is displayed in film as like based on two things, which is size and angle. If we have something, you know, really small and we're looking kind of down at it, then it's probably not going to be that important, and it's not going to be that, you know, powerful in our frame. But if we're really close up to something and we're looking up at it, like literally looking up at it, then it's going to be a lot more powerful. So you can kind of use this to convey all kinds of different things. Like let's say if I wanted to have OE9 be really powerful, like he's literally looking down at me, I might do that. If I wanted to have the reverse be true, I could do something like this, where I'm literally like maybe 5 times his size. But it really just depends on what you're trying to go for. I mean, the whole purpose is to, you know, build a relationship between your two subjects in your frame, and by changing their size and the angle by which you're shooting at, it kind of helps illustrate that and just helps tell a story better. The next thing you're going to want to keep in mind is DOF. Now DOF can be, you know, all kinds of things. It can be, you know, where you're placing your subjects in the foreground, the background, the middle ground. It can also be, you know, the kind of blur you want, or if you're going to put fog or effects on it. But basically it's just the levels of your composition. So we're going to have a foreground, which is, you know, around here. I have a torch. We have a midground, which is this like train track here. It has me on it, it has that guy. And then we have a background, which includes all those islands and OE9 over there in the corner. Just make your elements balanced. So that's DOF. And if you want to change your actual depth of field, if we go to shaders, as you can see, I have a lot of different depth map shaders. But essentially, there's a video in the description which shows you how to modify your depth shaders so that you can record at different depth of fields. As you see, this one's really close. I can go ahead and change it to a farther one, which gives me more control in After Effects when I'm going to be adding, you know, fog or blur. And this just allows you to have different range of, you know, blur or effects. But that's more of stuff you're doing in post. It's just important to keep in mind what kind of depth you want when you're actually recording, so you know which depth shader to use. So another really cool thing that you can do with your scenes to add a bit of spice is framing. And essentially what you can do with framing is have like a kind of natural frame around your subject. So in this case we have, you know, this kind of like stone building essentially, and we're peeking out through this little hole here. But what that does is it essentially adds a foreground element that goes around our subject, which would be this guy, or maybe that person too. But the idea being that you have a foreground element that kind of naturally encompasses them. So let's look for a different frame. So like this, it would be an example of another frame where we have, you know, this archway sort of thing here, and then we have our subjects in, you know, the background. And you know, there's plenty of different places where you can get frames, and they don't always have to go like all the way around. Sometimes they could just go partially around. So that's pretty much it for this part. In the next part, I'll probably be going over different types of movement you can have in your cinematics and stuff like that. But that's pretty much it for composition, and I will see you in the next video.